example of what I'm talking about. One of the most important finds in Mesopotamia is what is called the Epic of Gilgamesh. This is the story of a king. His name is Gilgamesh, and his lonely travels as he seeks to uncover the meaning of life. And as the tale unfolds, Gilgamesh's best friend, Enkidu, dies by the decree of the gods. Gilgamesh is crushed, and he becomes obsessed with the awful reality that he too must die one day. So he searches for a way to escape the fate of all humanity. He eventually hears of one who did escape, a certain man named Utnapishtim, who was the survivor of a great flood. After finding Utnapishtim, Gilgamesh asks him, what's the meaning to life? What's the secret to eternal life? Utnapishtim tells him about the flood, how he built an ark, loaded it with animals, and survived a torrential rain. Before leaving the ark, Utnapishtim sent forth a dove and a raven, and upon emerging, he sacrificed to the gods. Now, what's the problem? Of course, I think we see it clearly, don't we? That there are many similarities between the biblical account of the flood and the Gilgamesh epic from Mesopotamia. And this suggests a definite relationship between the two. The question, of course, is what is that relationship? And that's what Enza's book is doing, attempting to define what that relationship is. Now, one factor that it's important for us to understand is the truth that the Mesopotamian accounts were written long before the biblical account. We have extant documents of the Epic of Gilgamesh that date to the late 3rd millennium BC. We're talking about 2300, 2200 years before Christ. The earliest biblical account we have was written in the middle of the 2nd millennium BC. Now that's if we accept Mosaic authorship and that we date Moses to the middle of the 2nd millennium, which Enns, by the way, refuses to do. He would even date the written Torah to the middle of the 1st millennium BC. Okay, so we have to be very careful there. Now, because of this chronology, many scholars argue that the Hebrew account of the flood is directly dependent on the earlier Mesopotamian account. Friedrich Delitzsch, the son of the great conservative scholar Franz Delitzsch, concluded that the Bible was, quote, guilty of crass plagiarism. In his book called Babel und Bibel, he made that argument. Babel und Bibel, his question is, what's the relationship between Babel and the Bible? And his conclusion was, they are one and the same. Now, it's at this point I want to ask you, and here I'm not expecting an answer. This is rhetorical, but I merely want you to think about it. Is what Delitzsch and others conclude the only solution and conclusion that we can draw based upon the available evidence? Does the fact that two documents have parallels mean that the younger is dependent upon the older? Does it necessarily mean dependence at all, is the question. And what does Enns mean when he says that the Genesis accounts are firmly rooted in the mythological worldview of the time? Now, let me give you one possible answer to this for you to think about. Is that one possible answer is that these two documents, Epic of Gilgamesh, in fact, there are numerous documents of the Epic and the Bible, actually represent two traditions of the same event. And indeed, this would help to explain the many dissimilarities between the biblical account and the Mesopotamian account. How does one explain, when you read the Epic of Gilgamesh, how does one explain the polytheism, the theogony, or the creation of the various gods, the cosmic wars? How does one explain the magic that is at the center of the Epic of Gilgamesh? These things that dominate the Epic of Gilgamesh, but they're nowhere in the Bible. Well, many scholars would argue that, well, the Bible writers, biblical writers, came and they cleaned up all that nonsense. They got rid of the magic, and they got rid of the polytheism, they got rid of the theogony, and they made it more Yahwistic. Well, it seems to me that perhaps that is untrue. That perhaps what we have is two separate accounts and explanations of the same event. And I think that's very important. If a flood truly occurred in antiquity, one should be surprised not to find some references to it in and throughout ancient Near Eastern literature. Thus, when I look at the Epic of Gilgamesh, I'm encouraged by seeing the flood there. I'm not discouraged. I don't go into despair over that, as some scholars do. I think it's encouraging evidence of the historical truth of the flood. Now, what happened is the authors of the Epic of Gilgamesh, who were pagans, clearly vulgarized or bastardized that event. They distorted it by dressing it up with polytheism, by dressing it up with magic and violence and paganism. Historical fact had become myth in Mesopotamia. History became myth. And then I would suggest the Scriptures, on the other hand, relay a true historical, chronological account of the event. And that this account was passed down through the ages by oral tradition, which is quite good. Don't get nervous about oral tradition. And it was written down by Moses by the inspiration of the Holy Spirit. It's not a problem.